Let's get started. Ooh. Hi, everyone. Others might drip. Harrison, I'm a professor in political science. Thesis supervisor. I'd like to begin that we're meeting on the ancestral of the Musk. I know we've got some folks on Zoom, and many of us live as well on the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of these Tsleil-Waututh nations, among others. It is my pleasure to speak. He came to UBC after finishing his Bachelor of Arts in Sustainable Development at where he won Rachel Howell contribution to sustainable development through actions on campus. He has recently, last month, extended the master's thesis in a fantastic defense. The other examiners are here and went swimmingly. He'll be summarizing to say that Sveinar came here as an international student and immersed himself in learning a lot of minutiae about electricity systems and the fossil fuel industry in Canada, as well as his home country in Norway.
Hey, thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'm going to try and run through this in 15 minutes, which might be a challenge, but we'll give it a go. So in this presentation, I will be presenting the findings of what eventually became my master's thesis in a project titled Renewable Energy Politics in Fossil Fuel Producing Jurisdiction, a comparison between Norway and Alberta. So, as we all know, effective climate change mitigation demands a transition away from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. Yet, despite this, the global energy supply mix continues to be heavily dominated by fossil fuels. And so, within this context, fossil fuel producing jurisdiction appear and offer a particularly interesting lens for studying both support and opposition to renewables. These jurisdictions, they have unique political economies, where state and fossil fuel industry interests are often blurred. And Norway and Alberta are similar in that regard. They're both large producers and exporters of fossil fuels, but they have taken very different approaches to renewable electricity development. On the one hand, we have Norway, which has subsidized an expensive offshore wind sector, offering support to large-scale projects in 2 different sea basins. And on the other hand, we have Alberta, which has implemented restrictive regulations on a booming wind and solar sector. This manifested first through a 7-month moratorium on renewable electricity approvals, and then by implementing regulation, which actually restricts where these developments can take place. So I was curious to what factors explain this difference and this difference in policy support. And generally, I found that this difference is explained by a fundamental difference in decarbonization pressures, manifested primarily through electorally and institutional differences. And very quickly, to answer this question, I employed a framework called the Interest, Ideas, and Institutions. This looks at policy change as a product of these 3 components. In terms of interests, I have operationalized that as the policymaker's self-interested goal of re-election. In terms of policymaker ideas, these are the knowledge and beliefs that shape how policymakers interpret reality and also envision the future. And these ideas are then especially compelling if the policies introduced carry any electoral risk, as that means there are other motivations beyond voter alignment. And finally, I'm focusing on the role of the European Union, which Norway is partially integrated with, and the federal Canadian government. And based on previous literature, I had 4 guiding hypotheses for this research to explain the difference. The first one focuses on differences in public pressure. The second looks at whether the interests of the fossil fuel industry intersects with renewables. The third looks at the ideological orientation of the governments. And the fourth looks at the extent to which higher level governments push for more climate action. And I've used both primary and secondary data for this, including document analysis and interviews. So let's jump into the first case study. Norway has historically had this tremendous electricity surplus with access to vast emission-free electricity from hydroelectricity. And this has in the past provided a low incentive to expand renewable electricity production. However, with increasing electrification, we have seen the increased need to expand this production. And as will be clear, in this context, offshore wind has emerged as the most politically viable option for this expansion. And so let's take a look at the Norwegian public. The Norwegian public contributes to strong electoral pressures to reduce emissions. However, we also see a very strong public opposition, much more effective onshore wind due to local land use impacts, and which also includes indigenous opposition from the Sami people. And the result of this strong opposition is that since 2019, no new project approvals have been implemented, and a majority of the Norwegian public is actually against onshore wind. And amidst Norway's rising need for more electricity, this has situated offshore wind as the most politically feasible alternative for expanding electricity production. And then let's pivot to the interest of the fossil fuel industry. So offshore wind, and then in particular floating installations, benefit from having these very strong industrial overlaps with the oil and gas supply and shipbuilding industry. And this is an industry that provides the oil and gas producing industry with vessels and platform construction, equipment manufacturing, and also maintenance. And it's Norway's second most valuable industry after the production industry itself. And so offshore wind then becomes this industrial adventure that not only builds on Norway's existing industries and competencies, but also becomes a way in which workers who might in the future lose their jobs from a dwindling oil and gas industry can continue working with these very similar technologies in the shared offshore environment. So it's important to note that despite some increasing skepticism, there is still a strong public majority in favor of offshore wind. So there's no clear evidence of any large electoral risk when the Labour Party introduced these subsidies. However, a notable observation is that offshore wind has broad political support across the spectrum, and also among the traditionally major parties, the Labour and the Conservatives. Both these parties are in fact pro-transition, and they both, as a result, see the need for more electricity clearly, as well as the importance of protecting this important oil and gas supply and shipbuilding industry. And so even though there has been increasing skepticism from the right amidst increasing subsidies, it seems unlikely that things would have been different because of this convergence in bipartisan priorities. Finally, Norway's integration with the EU through the EEA agreement means that the country aligns with most energy and climate policy. And although Norway's increasing ambitions aligns with increasing European ambitions, I did not find this integration to be a primary driver of the policy developments, although some indirect pressure might remain plausible. But what the EU has done is that it creates this political environment that is more conducive to renewable electricity development. Norway is aligned with EU climate targets and is also embedded in the EU emissions trading scheme, which creates these strong pressures to decarbonize. And this has, for example, been a strong factor in a large-scale electrification of the oil and gas sector that has occurred over the last 5 to 7 years. So let's shift our attention to Alberta. So between 2018 and 2023, Alberta saw this rather large growth in renewable electricity capacity. And this brought investments, this brought jobs, and economic growth to the province. However, this 7-month pause and the following regulations has altered the regulatory environment. These regulations restricts development on prime agricultural land and also establishes buffer zones to protect scenic views from especially wind turbines. So let's look at what drove this decision. With regards to the Albertan public, we see a public that produces generally less electoral pressure to reduce emissions, as shown, for example, by the province's relatively low belief in anthropogenic climate change. However, we also see this rising public, but very local opposition to renewable energy projects in rural Alberta. These concerns are diverse. They span from concerns about displacement of agricultural land to concerns about pollution, sound and visual pollution. However, what is notable is that these concerns are not necessarily shared by the broader population, because a strong majority of the population actually supports increased renewable energy development. And polling right down after the 2023 pause also suggests that a majority of the population was against this decision, which indicates some electoral risk. And these concerns may be further contextualized by the roots of the current Conservative government under Daniel Smith, who implemented the pause and the subsequent regulation. So this government formed as a merger of the Progressive Conservatives and the Wild Rose Party in 2017. And this Wild Rose Party, which Smith came from, have very strong roots in rural southern Alberta, where most of all renewable developments actually take place. And I found some evidence that this might have helped create a sort of heightened sensitivity to what was, in the bottom line, very localized concerns, or very local concerns. Nonetheless, what is completely certain is that this local rural opposition has been central to the policy developments. With regards to the fossil fuel industry, I did not really find any evidence of these regulations being a deliberate attempt of protecting producers and natural gas generating utilities. And additionally, and just as important, I found no evidence of any industry synergy between the two, that is renewables and the oil and gas industry, as these industries appear to be very much geographically distinct and economically distinct. So the lukewarm support for the renewables pause indicated earlier indicates some electoral risk with these regulations. And other evidence, in fact, suggests that the government has tried to bolster up a rationale for the 7-month pause by framing it as regulator-driven. However, my findings show that the pause did come from the Premier's office, with regulators actually expressing concern about the impact of the pause on the investment climate for renewables. And if we adopt a more temporal lens, we also see strong ideological shifts between subsequent governments in Alberta. In 2016, the left-wing NDP government actually subsidized renewables, while the subsequent United Conservative government under Jason Kenney removed those subsidies and reinstated a more free market approach to electricity regulation in 2019. And then under Daniel Smith, we've seen this rise in renewable skeptic rhetoric. Renewables are consistently described as unreliable, intermittent, while contingent natural gas generation, in fact, is described as the only viable pathway to grid reliability and stability. And finally, let's look at the influence of the Canadian federal government. Under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Canada has adopted a more assertive approach on climate, reflected, for example, through the clean electricity regulations, which pledge to achieve net zero by 2035. That is the electricity system. But these policies, they are met with this strong opposition from Albertan policymakers, and this exhibits the dynamics or characteristics of Canadian federalism, which is that the federal structure grants provinces significant discretion to deviate from federal climate plans. And so federal targets are not considered a provincial responsibility, and this is a bipartisan stance. And within this institutional setup, the Albertan government has exercised its discretion to adopt a weak, non-binding target to reach net zero by 2050. So let's pivot back to the original hypotheses and try and explain the difference. The evidence does suggest higher electoral pressures for climate action in Norway compared to Alberta. And this finding is also consistent with Norway's much stronger emission targets. We also see that both jurisdictions have experienced strong local opposition to renewable electricity, or public opposition. And so in general, I find partial support for this public support hypothesis, given that it's not in fact clear that the Norwegian public demands renewable electricity specifically much more than Albertans, who are also generally pro-renewables, with opposition concentrated in local pockets. And so preserving oil and gas interests is naturally important to both jurisdictions, but the study finds that the extent to which this intersects with the renewable industry vary greatly. And so in Norway, offshore wind offers strategic value to the oil and gas adjacent industry by offering transition pathways for the oil and gas supply and shipbuilding industry. While in Alberta, there's little evidence of synergies or industrial overlaps at all. And although the incentives to restrict renewables to defend the interests of the fossil fuel sector might align in theory, this does not seem to be a driver of policy developments. And so I find support for this hypothesis. So In terms of political ideology, in Alberta, we see this government with limited climate ambitions, and which seems to portray renewables primarily as a risk that needs to be managed, which contrasts greatly to natural gas, which is portrayed as a cornerstone of system reliability. We also see this big difference in different approaches pursued by different government factions or administrations. In contrast, in Norway, we have this strong bipartisan support for offshore wind, with offshore wind actually supporting a range of policy goals that are embraced by both the Labour and the Conservatives. And so we see this convergence of cross-party interests, both of which are well supported by offshore wind. And so the difference doesn't entirely seem to be explained by left-right ideological divides, and it might also be important to consider the role of the respective electoral systems in incentivizing less or more political divides between individual parties. And finally, with regards to the influence of supranational pressures, we see a Norway that is experiencing strong pressures and sustained decarbonization pressures through its integration with the EU, which has created pressures to electrify various emission-intensive operations. And while in Alberta, we see a Canadian federalism that grants significant autonomy to provinces in key policy areas, such as electricity policy. And this allows the province to actually decouple their electricity policy from national climate objectives. And so I find strong support for this hypothesis, with the comparison leading to the somewhat paradoxical outcome where a subnational jurisdiction seemingly possesses more agency and autonomy over their own climate policy than a nation state. And so let's quickly wrap up. I argue that the difference here is explained by this fundamental difference in decarbonization pressures, with Norway having stronger pressures. And this creates two political contexts that are more and less conducive to renewable electricity expansion. And so on the one hand, we have Norway, which has the stronger pressure that manifests through increased electrification efforts. This puts the electricity grid under pressure and demands new sources of production. And in turn, this public opposition to onshore wind has situated offshore wind as the only viable source of large-scale new production, which, although expensive as a source of electricity in an isolated sense, has this additional benefit that it helps achieve central policy objectives endorsed by both major parties. And so in Alberta, we see much weaker decarbonization pressures. And within this context, the government has a government with limited transition aspirations and a much stronger commitment to maintaining natural gas as the primary source of electricity generation, further reduces the incentives for continuing what has been a deregulated renewable electricity expansion. So I'm going to leave it there and open up for questions.
My name is Philippe Le Billon. Yeah, hi, my name is Philippe Le Billon. I'm a faculty at the Department of Geography and also an affiliate at IRES. It's my pleasure to introduce Clare Price. So Clare is an MSc student at the Chance Lab, connecting human and nature laboratory. And I'm not part of a committee, but I had the privilege of seeing her work closely with my wife, Karen Baker. And I think a bit of that work has been inspiring for you. And so I'll read a little bit what you sent me. And, so Clare comes from the far, far away land of Kansas.
Yeah.
But since then, she had the time to do a BSc here at UBC on the unceded and traditional and of the Musqueam people. And yeah, you've been continuing with your MSc. And now she's interested in intervention that are stemming from tech and policy that will make life tangibly better for people and nature. And that, of course, came from many places, including Karen. So thank you again for, prolonging these ideas with your own work. And we look forward to seeing you. And, Kai sends his regrets. He cannot be here because he's on sabbatical. Thank you.
Yeah. Sabbatical's treating him kindly. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and to Sveinar for that treat of a presentation. It's always nice to know what's behind the curtain of all of our projects. I had no idea, but it's interesting stuff. And of course, Philippe, for coming today to introduce me, it means a lot. So the presentation I'm going to give you all today is centered around the kind of conceptual and empirical development of my own thesis work, which for now I'm calling Sounds of the City, Linking Nature's Fading Notes, Rising Urban Noise, and Connection to Nature. And acknowledged on the slide there is my supervisor, Dr. Kai Chan, and committee member Milena Drumeva, who is up on the hill over at SFU. So among many other things, something that I've learned is that master's projects are as much or more maybe about the story of the research development as they are the outputs and the papers that somehow come out of this. So over the last few years, I've bumbled my way into a lot of learning, both personal and otherwise. And in this short time today, I'm going to dangle the carrot of acoustic ecology in front of all of you, because I have the privilege of being one of not so many who are working on this at the university. So hopefully I can make the case that keeps you chasing the carrot and looking for this inspiration in your own work and lives. So I wanted to start us off by looking at this early figure from the 1980s from Dr. Barry Trow, who was kind of a founder of the field and also coming out of British Columbia. So here he has characterized the soundscape cycles of BC, and we're seeing things like wolves and elk and rain and all that deal. Maybe that makes sense, but we don't all come from British Columbia. So maybe some of us come from really big cities or somewhere a little bit smaller. This is just Victoria across the pond there. Maybe you came from a suburb or from somewhere much further away from a suburb. I've come from the far, far away land of Kansas, which is like somewhere in between that suburb and that field. So you're thinking like, so what? Why does this matter? Well, it matters because we are all here today gathered in this environment, in this room, in this city, that may be either acoustically familiar or foreign to you. Maybe it makes you feel comfortable or not. And it turns out all of that really matters, maybe to an extent that is far greater than you had realized. And we'll chat more about that. So what is acoustic ecology? Acoustic ecology is the field that is principally concerned with these questions, which is kind of smallish and emerging, and it's arisen around the study of humans, non-humans, and their shared sonic environments. So we're especially interested in the relationships that emerge from those shared sonic environments, and oftentimes the way that we leverage that is through study of what's called the soundscape, which is just a nice way of referring to the total acoustic environment, which includes things like the biophony, which is living organisms, the geophony, which is the sounds of the world moving around you, think of water or rocks, and the anthrophony, which are human-made sounds. That's where we come in. A fancier way of saying that is the spatial and temporal distribution of sounds, especially related to the sound propagation effects. So fields like physics come into play because we're wondering about how sound is moving through these shared environments. Beyond all of that, today we're making the case for like why we should be specifically tuning into the overlap of ecology, culture, and health, given their very fragile and interconnected fates, especially in shared urban environments. And we'll start by asking questions like, what does this place sound like? Why does it sound like that? And what does it tell us about the ecological and social condition? To clue you in a little bit more into what's going on with us, our human ears get us the range between 20 and 20,000 decibels, which is kind of boring compared to a dolphin or a dog, but it's like pretty good overall. We get to hear a lot of stuff. On the right is a chart that might contextualize this a little bit further with some common sounds. A typical conversation lands somewhere around 60 decibels, and a jet plane is up there at 130. I want to remind you that decibels scale logarithmically, which just means that something that is 80 decibels is actually 100 times more intense than something at 60 decibels. So it doesn't seem like that big of a gap, but experientially, it really matters. So given all of this, and maybe the cogs are turning now, what if I told you that in Vancouver, our noise bylaws only really start to kick in terms of enforcement, when you can pick up the phone and call someone, between 75 and 90 decibels. So if we look at the chart, that's really entering the range of harm being done to ourselves, and not only our hearing, but if you consider specific populations and what elongated exposure does, we might be able to start to anticipate the story and how it goes, which lands us on sort of like the first prong of the questioning that we do in my project, which is on acoustics and public health. So the research that connects poor health effects with exposure to loud places is actually very clear. It's kind of like the most established rung of this ladder. We know that chronic noise is established as the most the second most important threat to human health behind air pollution. And the exposure is shown to not only drive hearing loss, tinnitus, hypersensitive sound, but also cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, sleep disturbance, stress, mental health and cognition problems, memory impairment and attention deficit, childhood learning delays, even low birth weight. And unfortunately, we're starting to draw parallels between things like dementia and sound exposure. So this is starting to sound a little bad. Don't worry, we'll turn the corner in a minute here. But in Canada, we know that an estimated 1 in 5 people are affected by mental illness, which costs somewhere around $50 billion annually, and it also drives higher rates of disability and mortality. So as our population in Canada is aging and also urbanizing, we can estimate that within 1 generation, almost 9 million Canadians will be living with a mental illness. And as mentioned, the neighborhood characteristics, like we were thinking about with exposure to jet planes and loud sounds, and geographic inequalities can really explain the mental health conditions that we see today, and particularly the urban conditions like sound. But this is the branch that we've slightly less established. Something that many people in the room today might be studying parallel to public health is the biodiversity crisis. So I won't talk too much about this because it's another sad story, but alongside public health crises is a collapse in urban songbird populations with an estimated loss of somewhere around 3 billion birds since the 1970s. And a lot of these are the little charming guys that are singing to us. So yes, like I said, it might seem a little grim, but I do want to share that there are those species who find a lot of success in cities, become urban adapted. They tend to be kind of small and not that picky in terms of what they want to snack on. They lay fewer eggs and they forage in smaller areas. So maybe you have a little front yard bird that you're very fond of. They can also sing louder, higher, and longer. And so they're finding success. It's not all bad. We still have our birds, but we do need to be thinking about this when it comes to the total components of our urban spaces. Finally, and this is where a lot of the conceptual piece comes in, and especially Kai's former work, but when we think of the pinch of public health and then also access to nature and the waning quality of these natural places due to the loss of birdsong, we need to explore the role of acoustics within this relational ecosystem services framework. And like I said, that's some of the work that people over at IRES are doing, like Kai and Terry, thinking about human action and the relational values that emerge from how you move throughout your day-to-day life. So we're thinking about how sound might be fostering change values and human action, given that importance of your urban existence. And another theory that I've used a lot, which is called the extinction of experience. It was termed in the kind of mid-2010s, and it just refers to this disconnect from landscapes that is increasingly becoming a hallmark, with a study finding that urban residents across several cities spend over 87% of their time indoors, and in many cases another 8 to 10% on top of that in their cars. So value in soundscapes is not just an aesthetic exercise, it's also about our connection and our coexistence, and trying to think of policies that protect soundscapes. Maybe it's a quiet park or a wildlife corridor that supports this shared ecological and relational well-being. So moving on from that, we've maybe established the problem more effectively than any of us would like to confront, but we've rarely thought about these things as ecological systems. So policy tends to focus only on managing the absolute worst actors with tools like decibel thresholds or quiet hours, which for us reveals this conceptual tension between the rising densification of modern cities and the quality of your existence when you're in them. And this turning point that we're at, we are risking we're acquiring a widespread efficiency at the loss of a sensorially impoverished and a draining city that no one actually wants to be in. So hopefully I've established that we're in this nice little baby triangle right there in the middle of all of these things. And it makes us a nice home to start thinking about how to answer these questions beyond just meandering through the literatures. So that is where the project itself comes in. And in cracking at this tension, we're asking, how is rising anthropogenic noise and changing bird communities combining to transform people's acoustic experience of nature in the city? And how does the composition of an urban soundscape shift listener perceptions of that urban nature, which is kind of just one way of saying, what's the minimum amount of birdsong that we need to hear in order for a soundscape to feel even slightly natural, and then more importantly, restorative? So as an overview of the work, I start by reading just a horrific amount of papers where we meander through all of these questions. We're looking for these overlaps. Sometimes I feel okay about things because there is a lot of really good research that birdsong makes people feel better and less paranoid and happier in general. So that's a win. And then we start thinking about how do we start to measure this? I'm in that awesome operating space where like not that many people have done it. So I'm like bumping into a lot of walls and asking people and everyone's saying, I don't know, like you figure it out. And in response to that, what I've done is produce a series of soundscape compositions, which I'm happy to talk more about, but don't have the time to do today. So if you'd like to know more about in situ versus compositional work, please come ask me. And then it's followed up by a survey where we get at this relational element of sound and experience. I'll start just by showing you this map, which is adapted from Devonshire et al., who's here at UBC, and it contributes a novel local restorative nature index for Vancouver. So what this does is it geospatially assesses the restorative qualities of urban nature in relation to social vulnerability. This map does not consider sound, but sound is very compatible with the type of thinking that they're doing, which is why I started here. The little yellow triangles that you see are actually community centers, so we can kind of situate hearths of engagement for research across this spectrum. And just to kind of quickly break it down, the darkest pink areas are where we'll see the highest aggregate vulnerability, and the local restorative nature index being the lowest, which is basically an NDVI, or like density of greenness axis. So that story might align with what you would expect. And at these survey sites, which is available online and in surveys, I'm asking people to do things like rate suitability for activities, how they perceive wildlife presence, and then just generally rank, describe, and reflect on how their affect, perception of restoration, and perceived naturalness varies. So this operationalizes that conceptual model that we spent time on that links acoustic metrics, which are biophony and anthrophony, to these perceptual and relational purposes. Moving right along, the recordings themselves, I also can't spend that much time on, but they are a combination of different base cases, which include species which were chosen for being urban adapted, and compositionally a combination of calls and songs, because that probably matters, but we also don't know how much, so that's a variable to control for. And then the base cases anthropogenically include things like traffic and construction in different amounts. And then this urban hum, which maybe you've noticed, it's kind of like the base amount of sound that you're always exposed to. To kind of like start to wrap it up, so maybe we can have a chat about this, I wanted to leave you with the impression that urban sound is just not neutral at all, whether you believed that before or not. And instead it has this very sharp reflective quality of ecological structure, well-being, and social inequity. We have the feeling, our little research team, that biophonic richness can cultivate not only bolstered public health and well-being, but also a pro-environmental identity that is this relational feedback that maybe leads to different behaviors down the road. And we're seeing that policy regimes in general are acoustically myopic, which just means that they manage noise, but they're ignoring voice. So there's this much richer component that is not being integrated. And there's a huge potential, I think, for positive transformation in that management. And my goal is to kind of support that. What's cool about this work right now is that the University of Oregon just published their first scan of their city in terms of exposure to sound. It gets up to 86 along these like highways and corridors. You start to think about who's exposed, and we can really map that onto the map of Vancouver. So this is a great potential for further work. And then I won't read them off at you, but basically we just bumbled around, like I said, for the whole first year looking for the place to start, because there's just so much space for it. One of the ones that I've kind of returned to is the transformation that is prompted by EV infrastructure. Very curious about that, but there's so many directions. Like I said, this is changing at more or less breakneck pace, which is a really fun thing to be a part of. And I didn't want to end without mentioning, like Philippe said at the beginning, that the role of my former mentor, Dr. Bucker, was extremely integral in the development of this work. And my time as her research assistant during both the writing and the publishing of The Sounds of Life and Gaia's Webs were not only foundational to my growth as a student, but also as a thinker. And the fact that I got to start working with these concepts so many years ago in my undergrad is just a privilege that I kind of can't even quite wrap my head around. So I want to give a lot of credit to her for picking up these questions before a lot of other people were. And of course, thank you very much to all of the supports I've received of many different types. I don't think this work is possible without that. And I'm very grateful to be here doing it. And I'll end on a quote that is important to Karen and myself, and answer some questions.